The October sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains when Jeremiah Jed Mitchell first spotted the two small figures walking along the dusty road that led to his ranch. At 68 years old, Jed had spent 40 years building his spread in the Wyoming territory, and his eyes were still sharp enough to spot trouble from a mile away. These two walking figures, one clearly much smaller than the other, definitely looked like trouble of the heart-wrenching kind. As the figures drew closer, Jed could see that they were children, boys by their clothing and gait. The older one appeared to be maybe 14, tall for his age but painfully thin, with shoulders that carried far too much responsibility for someone so young. The smaller boy, who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, was being half-carried by his older companion, his small legs clearly struggling to keep up with the determined pace. His brother was setting. Jed dismounted from his horse and approached them slowly, his weathered hands raised in a gesture of peace. The older boy immediately stepped protectively in front of his younger brother, his stance defensive despite his obvious exhaustion. "Easy there, son," Jed said gently, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had spent decades working with skittish animals. "I'm not looking to hurt you. Name's Jed Mitchell. This is my ranch you're walking past." The older boy studied Jed carefully, taking in the clean clothes, the well-maintained horse, and the prosperous ranch buildings visible in the distance. His eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of adult motives, but also the desperate calculation of someone running out of options. "My name is Daniel Walsh," the boy said finally, his voice hoarse from thirst and fatigue. "This is my little brother Timothy. We're just passing through, sir. We don't want any trouble." Jed noticed the way Daniel's hand rested protectively on Timothy's shoulder, the way the smaller boy leaned against his brother for support. Both children were dressed in clothes that had once been decent, but were now patched and worn, clearly outgrown, but the only garments they possessed. "Where are you boys headed?" Jed asked, though he suspected the answer was that they had no destination, only the desperate need to keep moving in hopes of finding something better than what they'd left behind. Daniel's jaw tightened with the kind of pride that poverty often forced upon the young. "We're looking for work, sir. I'm a good worker, and Timothy doesn't eat much. We can earn our keep. Is that so?" Jed asked mildly, though his heart was already breaking at the sight of these two children trying to survive on their own. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything, sir. I can clean stables, mend fences, help with cattle. I'm stronger than I look, and I learn quick." Jed glanced at Timothy, who was swaying slightly on his feet, his young face pale with exhaustion and hunger. The child's eyes were too large for his thin face, and his clothes hung on his small frame like fabric draped over a scarecrow. "When did you boys last eat?" Jed asked quietly. Daniel's defenses immediately went up, recognizing the sympathy in the rancher's voice, and fearing that pity might lead to being turned away or, worse, reported to authorities who might separate them. "We ate yesterday," Daniel lied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Yesterday," Jed repeated, his tone gentle but skeptical. Timothy looked up at his brother with confusion, clearly not understanding why Daniel wasn't telling the truth. "But Danny, we haven't eaten since." "Timothy," Daniel interrupted quickly, his voice sharp with warning. But the damage was done, and Jed could see the truth written plainly on both their faces. Jed knelt down so that he was at Timothy's eye level, his movements slow and unthreatening. "Timothy, when did you last have a proper meal?" The little boy looked between his brother and the kind-faced stranger, unsure of what he was supposed to say. Finally, his hunger and innocence won out over his brother's protective caution. "My little brother hasn't eaten in 2 days," Daniel said suddenly, his voice breaking with the admission. "I gave him the last of our bread yesterday morning, but there's nothing left. I've been telling him we'll find food soon, but..." His voice trailed off as the weight of their desperate situation finally overcame his determination to handle everything alone. The words hit Jed like a physical blow. 2 days without food for a child Timothy's age was dangerous, potentially life-threatening. Looking at the boy's pale complexion and the way he was leaning heavily against his brother, Jed realized they had arrived at his ranch just in time. "Well, now," Jed said, standing and brushing the dust from his knees, It seems to me that this problem has a simple solution. You boys are coming home with me for supper, and we'll figure out the rest afterward." "Sir, we can't accept charity," Daniel protested, his pride warring with his desperation. "If you'll just give me work, I can pay for any food we eat." "Who said anything about charity?" Jed asked with a slight smile. "I've got more work than I can handle, and my cook quit last month to get married. Seems like you boys showing up when you did is good. Luck for all of us." Daniel wanted to believe it was that simple, but life had taught him to be suspicious of good fortune. "What kind of work?" "Same kind you mentioned. Cleaning stables, mending fences, helping with cattle. The pay is room, board, and $1 a week to start. More when you prove yourself. Does that sound fair?" Before Daniel could respond, Timothy's legs finally gave out completely, and he would have collapsed if his brother hadn't caught him. The little boy's eyes rolled back, and for a terrifying moment, Jed thought the child was going to faint from hunger and exhaustion. "That settles it," Jed said firmly, scooping Timothy up in his strong arms. "We're getting this boy fed and rested. Right now, Daniel, you can make your decision about the work after we take care of your brother." Daniel found himself following the rancher toward the ranch house, his protective instincts warring with his relief at finally meeting an adult who seemed to genuinely want to help them. Timothy felt so light in Jed's arms, so fragile and vulnerable, that Daniel was suddenly terrified by how close they had come to complete disaster. As they approached the ranch house, Daniel could smell something wonderful cooking, something rich and nourishing that made his stomach clench with desperate hunger. Through the windows, he could see a warm, well-lit kitchen that looked like something from a dream of security and comfort. "Mr. Mitchell," Daniel said quietly, "why are you helping us? You don't know anything about us. We could be criminals or troublemakers." Jed paused at the front steps and looked down at the boy seriously. "Daniel, I've lived long enough to recognize good people when I meet them. You've been taking care of your little brother, putting his needs before your own, trying to find honest work instead of stealing or begging. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. But what if we disappoint you? What if we're not as useful as you hope?" Jed smiled, and for the first time since their parents had died, Daniel saw in an adult's face the kind of unconditional acceptance he remembered from childhood. "Son," Jed said gently, "the only way you could disappoint me is if you don't give Timothy the chance to be a child again. He's been carrying too much worry for someone his age, and it's time for him to feel safe." As they entered the warm, welcoming ranch house, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Maybe, just maybe, their long journey of survival was finally over, and they had found a place where they could stop running and start living again. 2 weeks had passed since Jed Mitchell had carried a half-starved Timothy Walsh into his ranch house, and the transformation in both boys had been nothing short of miraculous. The kitchen that had once echoed with the loneliness of an old bachelor now rang with the sounds of boyhood, conversations, and the kind of domestic warmth that Jed had forgotten he missed. Timothy sat at the sturdy wooden table, his cheeks now rounded with proper nutrition and his eyes bright with the curiosity of a child who finally felt safe enough to explore the world around him. He was carefully copying letters from a primer that Jed had found in town, his small tongue protruding slightly in concentration as he worked to make each character perfect. "Look, Danny," Timothy called out excitedly as his older brother entered the kitchen from the morning chores. "I can write my whole name now." Daniel smiled as he examined his brother's careful work, feeling a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before their parents' death. 6 months ago, Timothy looked like a different child, healthy and happy and secure in the knowledge that there would be food on the table and a warm bed to sleep in. "That's real good, Tim," Daniel said, ruffling his brother's hair affectionately. "You'll be reading books before you know it. Mr. Jed says he has a whole shelf of books I can read when I get good enough," Timothy said proudly. "He says some of them have pictures of faraway places and adventures." Daniel looked around the kitchen, still sometimes unable to believe that this comfortable, secure place had become their home. Jed had been true to his word about providing work, and Daniel had thrown himself into his duties with the determination of someone who understood exactly how precious this opportunity was. Where "Is Jed this morning?" Daniel asked, noting the rancher's absence from his usual place at the breakfast table. "He's out checking the north pasture," Timothy replied, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "But he said to tell you that Mrs. Henderson from town is coming to visit today." He seemed kind of nervous about it. Daniel frowned, feeling a familiar, knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Mrs. Henderson was a well-meaning woman who ran the local women's charitable society, but her visits often involved questions about children's welfare and living situations. "Did he say why she's coming?" "Something about making sure we're being properly cared for," Timothy said, his innocence evident in his lack of concern about the visit. Mr. Jed seemed to think it was just formalities. Daniel hoped that was all it was, but he had learned to be wary of official visits and adult concerns about orphan children. Too often, such interest led to well-meaning interventions that separated families and sent children to institutions that were supposed to be for their own good. When Jed returned from his morning ride, Daniel noticed the tension in the rancher's posture and the way his eyes kept drifting toward the road that led to town. "Jed," Daniel said carefully, "Timothy told me about Mrs. Henderson's visit. Is there something we should be worried about?" Jed poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down heavily at the table, his weathered face showing every one of his 68 years. "Daniel, I'm going to be straight with you because you deserve honesty. Mrs. Henderson received word that there were orphan children living at my ranch, and she feels obligated to investigate their welfare." "Investigate?" Daniel's voice sharpened with alarm. "What does that mean?" "It means she wants to make sure you boys are being properly educated, fed, and supervised. She's concerned that an old bachelor like me might not be equipped to raise children." Daniel felt his chest tighten with the familiar panic of potential separation from his brother. What will happen if she decides we're not being properly cared for? Jed reached across the table and placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Son, that's not going to happen. You boys are thriving here, anyone can see that. But Mrs. Henderson has certain ideas about what constitutes proper care for children, and some of those ideas involve formal schooling and religious instruction. We can't go to school." Daniel said quickly, "If we're in school, I can't work. And if I can't work, we can't stay here." "Daniel, listen to me," Jed said firmly. "You're not going anywhere. I've grown too fond of you boys to let anyone take you away. But we need to show Mrs. Henderson that you're receiving appropriate education and guidance." Timothy looked up from his writing practice, sensing the tension in the conversation, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. "Are we in trouble, Danny?" "No, Tim," Daniel said quickly, forcing a reassuring smile. "We're just talking about grown-up things." Before Jed could respond, the sound of an approaching carriage announced Mrs. Henderson's arrival. Through the kitchen window, they could see a respectable buggy being driven by a stern-looking woman in her 50s, accompanied by a younger woman Daniel didn't recognize. "That'll be Mrs. Henderson and her assistant, Miss Hartwell," Jed said, standing and straightening his shirt. "Boys, just be yourselves, answer their questions honestly, and everything will be fine." Mrs. Henderson proved to be exactly what Daniel had expected, a well-meaning but officious woman who radiated the kind of moral certainty that came from never having doubted her own righteousness. She examined the ranch house with a critical eye, noting the cleanliness and order, but also the distinctly masculine environment that lacked feminine touches. "Mr. Mitchell," she said as they settled in the parlor, "while I commend your generosity in taking in these orphan children, I must express concern about their long-term welfare. Boys need more than food and shelter. They need proper education, moral guidance, and preparation for their futures as productive citizens." "I couldn't agree more," Jed replied calmly. "That's why Daniel has been learning ranch management and animal husbandry, skills that will serve him well in adult life. And Timothy has been working on his letters and numbers every morning." Miss Hartwell, who had been quietly observing the boys, spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Mitchell, while practical skills are valuable, these children also need formal education. They should be in school with other children their age, learning proper subjects from qualified teachers." Daniel felt his heart sink. Here was the argument he had been dreading, the reasonable-sounding logic that would tear apart the family they had built with Jed. "With respect, ma'am," Daniel said, finding his voice despite his fear, "I've learned more in the past 2 weeks working with Jed than I did in years of school. And Timothy is getting individual attention with his lessons, not sitting in a crowded classroom where he might get overlooked." Mrs. Henderson studied Daniel carefully, noting the boy's articulate speech and confident manner. "You express yourself well, young man, but what about your spiritual education? Are you receiving proper religious instruction? We say grace before meals." Timothy piped up helpfully. "And Mr. Jed reads to us from the Bible sometimes in the evenings." "That's commendable," Mrs. Henderson acknowledged. "But children need the fellowship of other young people, the guidance of a proper minister, the structure that only an established institution can provide." Jed leaned forward, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had served him well in business dealings. "Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your concern for these boys' welfare, but I think you should consider what they've achieved here before deciding that changes are necessary." "What do you mean?" "I mean that 2 weeks ago, Daniel was a boy who hadn't eaten in days but still put his brother's needs before his own. Timothy was so weak from hunger he could barely stand. Now look at them. They're healthy, happy, and learning skills that will serve them for life." Mrs. Henderson had to admit that both boys looked remarkably well cared for. Their clothes were clean and properly fitted, their faces showed the glow of good health, and their manner indicated that they felt secure and valued. "Nevertheless," she said, though with less conviction than before, "there are established procedures for the care of orphan children. The Territorial Orphanage in Cheyenne is well regarded and could provide them with comprehensive education and preparation for adult life." "No," Timothy said suddenly, his small voice filled with terror. "I won't go away from Danny and Mr. Jed. Please don't make me go away." The little boy's distress was so genuine and heartbreaking that even Mrs. Henderson seemed moved by it. Miss Hartwell looked uncomfortable, clearly not having expected such a passionate response from the children. "Timothy," Mrs. Henderson said more gently, "the orphanage isn't a punishment. It's a place where children like you can receive proper care and education." "But I want to stay here," Timothy said, tears streaming down his face. "This is home. Mr. Jed takes care of us, and Danny teaches me things, and I have my own bed and my own books and everything." Daniel moved to comfort his brother, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mrs. Henderson, please don't separate us. I know you think you're doing what's best, but we're a family here. Jed has given us something we thought we'd lost forever. And what's that, young man?" "Hope," Daniel said simply. "Hope that we have a future, that we matter to someone, that we're not just burdens to be managed by institutions." Mrs. Henderson looked around the room, taking in the evidence of a household where children were clearly cherished and valued. She saw the books that Jed had bought for Timothy, the careful attention to the boy's health and education, and most importantly, the genuine love that connected all three of them. "Mr. Mitchell," she said finally, "I will need to file a report with the territorial authorities about the boy's living situation." Jed's heart sank, but he nodded gravely. "I understand. My report will state that I found 2 orphan children living in a stable, loving home where their physical, educational, and moral needs are being met by a responsible guardian who clearly has their best interests at heart." The relief in the room was almost palpable. Daniel felt his knees go weak with gratitude, while Timothy launched himself into Jed's arms with a cry of joy. However, Mrs. Henderson continued, "I will be returning in 3 months to check on their progress. I expect to see continued evidence of proper education and development. You'll see that and more." Jed promised, his voice thick with emotion. "These boys have given me as much as I've given them. They've made this house a home again." As Mrs. Henderson and Miss Hartwell prepared to leave, the older woman paused at the door and looked back at the 3 of them, standing together like the family they had become. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other. I can see that's what has happened here. Subscribe to help us keep bringing you these incredible stories of family and hope from the frontier." 6 months after Mrs. Henderson's visit, the Mitchell Ranch had become known throughout the territory as a place where hard work was valued, kindness was practiced, And family meant more than blood relations, the legal adoption papers that made Daniel and Timothy Walsh officially Daniel and Timothy Mitchell sat framed on the mantelpiece. But the real bonds that held them together had been forged through shared work, mutual respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger with each passing day. Daniel, now 15, had grown tall and strong under Jed's guidance, his shoulders broadening with the physical work of ranching, and his confidence expanding with each new skill he mastered. He could rope a steer, mend a fence, and manage the ranch books with equal competence, and his natural leadership abilities had begun to emerge as he took on increasing responsibilities. Timothy, at 8 years old, was a bright, curious child who approached each day with the enthusiasm of someone who had learned that the world could be a safe and nurturing place. His reading had progressed to the point where he could tackle adventure stories on his own, and his quick mind had absorbed not just academic lessons, but the deeper wisdom that Jed shared about life, work, and character. "Dad," Timothy called out as he ran toward the barn where Jed and Daniel were working on repairing a broken gate. "There's a wagon coming up the road with a family in it. They look like they might need help." Jed set down his tools and shaded, his eyes against the afternoon sun, peering at the approaching wagon. He could see what Timothy had noticed, a tired-looking couple with several children, their possessions piled high in a wagon that had seen better days. It was a sight that had become increasingly common as more families ventured west in search of opportunities and fresh starts. "Looks like travelers," Jed observed. "Daniel, why don't you come with me to see what they need? Timothy, you can help by getting some water ready in case they're thirsty." As they approached the wagon, Jed could see that his initial assessment had been correct. The family consisted of a man and woman in their 30s, along with 3 children ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 12. Their clothes were clean but patched. Their faces showed the strain of long travel, and their wagon was loaded with the kinds of possessions that spoke of people who had left their previous life behind in hopes of building something better. "Afternoon," Jed called out in greeting. "I'm Jed Mitchell, and this is my son Daniel. You folks look like you could use a rest." The man driving the wagon studied Jed carefully, clearly weighing the offer against the caution that frontier travel had taught him. "I'm Robert Harper," he said finally. "This is my wife Sarah and our children. We're heading toward Laramie, looking for land to homestead. That's still a fair piece of travel." Jed observed, "Why don't you water your horses and rest for a spell? Sarah, you and the children are welcome to stretch your legs and maybe share a meal with us." Sarah Harper's relief was evident in her face. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Mitchell. We've been traveling for days, and the children are getting tired of the constant motion." As the Harper family accepted their hospitality, Jed found himself remembering another family that had arrived at his ranch tired, hungry, and in need of help. The memory of Daniel and Timothy's desperate situation just months ago made him even more determined to provide comfort to these traveling strangers. "Mr. Mitchell," Robert Harper said, as they unhitched his horses, "we've heard your name mentioned in several towns along the way. Folks speak highly of you and the work you do here." "What kind of work?" Jed asked, genuinely curious about his reputation among travelers. "They say you're a man who helps people when they need it most, that you took into orphan boys and gave them a real home, that you judge people by their character rather than their circumstances." Daniel felt a flush of pride at hearing his adoptive father praised by strangers. Over the months of living at the ranch, he had come to understand that Jed's kindness toward him and Timothy wasn't unusual behavior, but rather part of a lifelong pattern of helping others. "Jed does what needs doing," Daniel said simply. "That's just who he is." As the afternoon progressed and the Harper family rested from their journey, Jed found himself in conversation with Robert about the challenges of homesteading and the realities of frontier life. It became clear that Robert had some experience with farming, but was worried about his family's ability to survive the harsh Wyoming winters in whatever shelter they could build before the snow came. "Robert," Jed said thoughtfully, "what if I told you there might be another option? Something that could give your family security while you get established." "What kind of option?" Jed glanced around his property, seeing it with new eyes as he considered a possibility that had been growing in his mind for weeks. This ranch is getting too big for me to manage alone, even with Daniel's help. I've been thinking about bringing in a partner, someone who could work the land and help expand the operation. Robert's eyes showed cautious interest. What would that involve? It would involve you and your family staying here, working the ranch together with us. You'd have a share in the profits, a secure place to live, and your children would be raised alongside Timothy with all the advantages of a stable home. Sarah Harper looked up from where she was watching her children play with Timothy, her face showing the hope and disbelief of someone who had been offered more than she had dared to dream. Mr. Mitchell, she said carefully, that's an incredibly generous offer. But we're essentially strangers to you. Why would you trust? 3 weeks into their new life at the Mitchell Ranch, Daniel found himself facing his first real challenge when Jed announced that he needed to travel to Cheyenne for supplies and would be gone for days. The responsibility of managing the ranch in his absence would fall primarily on Daniel's shoulders, with Timothy helping as much as his age allowed. I've been putting off this trip for months, Jed explained as they sat around the breakfast table. But we're running low on winter supplies, and I need to conduct some business at the bank. The question is whether you boys feel ready to handle things here on your own. Daniel felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. While he had learned a great deal in their weeks at the ranch, the thought of being responsible for all the animals and equipment without Jed's guidance was daunting. What if something went wrong? What if he made a mistake that proved he wasn't ready for the trust Jed was placing in him? I think we can manage, Daniel said, trying to project more confidence than he felt. You've taught us the routines, and it's only for days. That's the spirit, Jed said approvingly. Mrs. Anderson from the neighboring ranch has agreed to check on you boys once a day, just to make sure everything's running smoothly. But the day-to-day work will be yours to handle. Timothy looked up from his pancakes with excitement rather than concern. Will we get to do everything by ourselves? Feed all the animals and gather eggs and everything? Everything, Jed confirmed. Which means you'll need to be extra careful and help your brother however you can. The morning of Jed's departure arrived gray and cold, with the promise of winter hanging heavy in the air. As their surrogate father loaded his wagon with supplies for the journey, Daniel felt a mix of pride and terror at the responsibility being placed on his young shoulders. Remember, Jed said, placing a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder, if anything happens that you can't handle, send Timothy to fetch Mrs. Anderson immediately. There's no shame in asking for help when you need it. We'll be fine, Daniel assured him, though his voice carried a slight tremor that betrayed his nervousness. As Jed's wagon disappeared down the road toward town, Daniel stood in the ranch yard looking around at everything that was now his responsibility. The cattle needed to be checked and moved to fresh pasture. The horses required daily care and exercise. The chickens needed feeding and their eggs collected, and dozens of other small tasks demanded attention. What should we do first? Timothy asked, looking to his older brother for guidance with the same trust he had always shown. First, we follow the routine exactly like Jed taught us, Daniel replied, grateful for the structure that their host had established. Feed the chickens, gather eggs, check on the horses, then move the cattle to the south pasture. The first day passed smoothly enough, with both boys working hard to complete all the necessary tasks. Daniel found that he remembered more than he had expected, and Timothy proved surprisingly helpful despite his small size and young age. By evening, they had successfully managed everything on Jed's list and were sitting down to a simple but satisfying dinner of their own preparation. We did good today, Timothy said proudly as he helped Daniel wash the dishes. We did well, Daniel corrected automatically, then smiled at his brother's enthusiasm. And yes, we managed just fine. The second day brought their first real challenge, when Daniel discovered that one of the horses, a mare named Duchess, was favoring her left front leg and showing signs of lameness. His heart immediately began racing as he considered the implications of a serious injury to one of Jed's valuable animals. Is she hurt bad? Timothy asked, noting his brother's concerned expression as Daniel examined the horse's leg. I'm not sure, Daniel admitted, running his hands carefully along the mare's leg and trying to remember everything Jed had taught. him about recognizing signs of injury or illness in horses. She's definitely sore, but I can't see any obvious cuts or swelling. Daniel spent the morning carefully observing Duchess, limiting her movement and trying to determine whether the lameness was serious enough to require immediate veterinary attention. The mare seemed comfortable when standing still, but clearly favored the leg when walking. Should we get Mrs. Anderson? Timothy suggested, remembering Jed's instructions about asking for help when needed. Daniel hesitated, torn between his desire to handle the problem independently and his fear of making the wrong decision about an animal's welfare. Finally, his concern for Duchess overcame his pride, and he sent Timothy to fetch their neighbor. Mrs. Anderson arrived within an hour, a capable woman in her 50s who had been ranching alongside her husband for 20 years. She examined Duchess with practiced hands, her expression serious but not alarmed. Looks like she might have stepped on a stone or piece of sharp wood, Mrs. Anderson diagnosed. There's a small puncture wound here on the sole of her hoof. It's not serious, but it needs to be cleaned and treated to prevent infection. Under Mrs. Anderson's guidance, Daniel learned how to clean and bandage the wound, how to recognize signs of infection, and how to modify the horse's activity level to promote healing. By the end of her visit, he felt much more confident about managing the situation. You did exactly the right thing calling for help, Mrs. Anderson told him as she prepared to leave. A good rancher knows when to ask for assistance, and there's no shame in being cautious when it comes to animal welfare. The third day tested Daniel's problem-solving abilities. When a section of fence in the north pasture developed a break, allowing several cattle to wander into an area where they could potentially damage crops or get lost. Discovering the problem during his morning check, Daniel had to quickly devise a plan to round up the straying animals and repair the fence. Before any serious damage occurred, Timothy, I need you to help me herd these cattle back to where they belong, Daniel said, trying to project calm authority despite his racing heart. Remember what Jed taught us about moving cattle slowly and calmly, working together. The brothers managed to guide the wayward cattle back through the fence opening and into the proper pasture. Then Daniel tackled the fence repair, using tools and techniques that Jed had shown him, but which he had never attempted independently. The work was harder than he had expected, requiring both physical strength and technical skill to properly tension the wire and secure the posts. By the time he finished, his hands were scratched and sore, but the fence was solid and functional. You fixed it, Timothy exclaimed with admiration as Daniel tested the repair by pulling on the wire. We fixed it, Daniel corrected, grateful for his brother's help and moral support throughout the challenging day. The fourth morning brought Jed's return, and Daniel felt a mixture of relief and pride as their surrogate father examined everything that had transpired during his absence. The ranch was in good order, the animals were healthy and well cared for, and the fence repair showed competent workmanship. Mrs. Anderson told me about the horse, Jed said as he checked Duchess's healing hoof. She said you handled the situation exactly right, showing good judgment and proper caution. I was scared I'd make the wrong decision, Daniel admitted. Being scared when you're responsible for something important is natural, Jed replied. The important thing is that you didn't let fear paralyze you. You assessed the situation, sought help when you needed it, and took appropriate action. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing stories of the past for days, Daniel felt a new sense of confidence in his abilities and his place in their small family. He had faced challenges and overcome them, proven himself capable of responsibility, and earned Jed's trust in a very practical way. I'm proud of both of you, Jed said as they prepared for bed. You've shown that this ranch is in good hands, no matter what the future brings. December arrived in Wyoming with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that plummeted below zero and snowdrifts that transformed the familiar landscape of the ranch into an alien wonderland of white. For Daniel and Timothy, who had never experienced a real frontier winter, the season brought both wonder and new challenges that tested everything they had learned about ranch life. The morning routine that had become second nature during autumn took on new complexity as ice covered water troughs. Animals required extra feed to maintain body heat, and simple tasks like gathering eggs became adventures that required careful navigation through knee-deep snow. "I can't feel my fingers," Timothy complained as he struggled to carry a bucket of warm water to the chickens, his small hands barely able to grip the handle through his oversized mittens. "Keep moving them," Daniel advised, demonstrating the finger exercises that Jed had taught them for preventing frostbite. "And remember to take breaks inside whenever you start getting too cold." Jed watched both boys adapt to winter conditions with growing admiration for their resilience and determination. Neither complained about the harsh conditions or suggested that ranch work should be abandoned in favor of staying warm indoors. Instead, they approached each new challenge with the problem-solving attitude that had helped them survive their months of homelessness. "The secret to surviving winter on a ranch," Jed explained as they worked together to break ice on the cattle's water supply, "is staying ahead of problems instead of reacting to them after they happen." This philosophy meant rising earlier to complete chores before the coldest part of the day, storing extra feed in easily accessible locations, and constantly monitoring animals for signs of cold stress or injury. Daniel absorbed these lessons eagerly, understanding that winter management skills would be essential if he hoped to someday run his own ranch. The boys' education continued despite the weather, with evening lessons by lamplight replacing some of the outdoor activities that had filled their autumn days. Timothy's reading had advanced dramatically, and he was now working his way through adventure stories that would have challenged children much older than his 8 years. "Listen to this, Danny," Timothy said one evening as he read aloud from Treasure Island. "Long John Silver says, 'I'm not a boasting man, and you've seen yourself how easy I keep company. But when I was quartermaster, lambs wasn't the word for Flint's old buccaneers.'" Daniel smiled at his brother's dramatic interpretation of the pirates' dialogue, remembering how much their mother had enjoyed reading to them in the evenings before illness had taken both their parents. The continuation of this tradition in their new home felt like a bridge between their past and present, honoring their parents' memory while building new traditions with Jed. "You're getting to be quite a reader," Jed observed approvingly. "Your mother would be proud of how well you've kept up with your education." The mention of their mother brought a moment of quiet reflection, as it always did, but the sadness was no longer overwhelming. Time and security had allowed both boys to remember their parents with love rather than grief, and to see their current happiness as something their parents would have wanted for them. One particularly harsh morning brought a crisis that tested all of Daniel's developing skills, when he discovered that the barn door had been left unlatched during the night, allowing wind and snow to accumulate inside the building where several animals had taken shelter. "The horses are shivering," Timothy reported, his breath visible in the frigid air as he checked on the animals. "And there's snow everywhere inside the barn." Daniel assessed the situation quickly, recognizing that the animals needed immediate relief from the cold and wet conditions. Working with systematic efficiency, he and Timothy moved the horses to a different section of the barn, used shovels to clear the accumulated snow, and spread fresh straw to provide insulation from the cold floor. "Now we need to check each animal for signs of cold stress," Daniel said, remembering Jed's teachings about recognizing hypothermia in livestock. "Look for shivering, lethargy, or any unusual behavior." Fortunately, their quick action had prevented any serious problems, but the incident served as a valuable lesson about the importance of attention to detail. During winter conditions, a simple oversight like an unlatched door could have resulted in sick or injured animals, or even deaths that would have been both heartbreaking and economically devastating. "Good thinking," Jed said when he learned about the morning's crisis and how the boys had handled it. "You're learning to think like a real rancher, anticipating problems and taking quick action when necessary." As winter deepened, the boys discovered that the isolation imposed by harsh weather had unexpected benefits. The long evenings provided opportunities for extended conversations with Jed, who shared stories of his own childhood, his experiences building the ranch, and his hopes for their future together. "I never expected to have a family again," Jed admitted one evening as they sat around the fire while wind howled outside. "After losing Sarah and little James, I thought that part of my life was over forever. "Are we really your family now?" Timothy asked, curling up closer to Jed on the sofa where they had been reading together. "You're more family to me than some people who share blood," Jed replied seriously. "Family isn't just about being related. It's about choosing to care for each other, to work together, to share both good times and difficult ones." Daniel felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the fireplace. The concept of chosen family resonated deeply with him, offering a way to honor his parents' memory while embracing the new relationships that had become so important to his and Timothy's survival and happiness. The Christmas season brought special challenges and opportunities as Jed introduced the boys to traditions that had been dormant in the ranch house for many years. Together, they cut a tree from their own land, decorated it with homemade ornaments, and planned a celebration that would mark their first major holiday as a family. "I haven't celebrated Christmas properly in 20 years, Jed confessed as they worked together to string popcorn for tree decorations. "It seemed pointless when there was no one to share it with. Mama used to make Christmas special even when we didn't have much money," Timothy remembered. "She said the important thing was being together and remembering to be grateful for what we had." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Jed said gently. "I think she would be happy to know that you boys are carrying on her traditions in your new home." Christmas morning arrived clear and cold, with sunlight sparkling on fresh snow that had fallen during the night. The boys woke to find that Jed had left carefully wrapped presents under their tree, practical gifts that showed thoughtful attention to their individual needs and interests. For Daniel, there was a leather-bound journal for recording ranch observations and plans, along with a set of high-quality tools that marked his transition from helper to junior partner in the ranch's operations. Timothy received a collection of books suitable for his advancing reading level, plus art supplies that would allow him to explore his emerging interest in drawing and sketching. "These are wonderful," Daniel said, running his hands over the smooth leather of his journal, "but we don't have anything for you." "You've given me the best gift possible," Jed replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me a reason to look forward to the future again." As winter continued its grip on the Wyoming landscape, the three members of their unconventional family grew closer through shared challenges and daily cooperation. Daniel's confidence in his abilities continued to grow, while Timothy flourished under the combination of security, education, and affection that had been missing from his life for so long. By March, when the first hints of spring began to appear in the Wyoming territory, Daniel and Timothy had been living at the Mitchell Ranch for 5 months. What had begun as a temporary arrangement born of desperation had evolved into something much deeper and more permanent, though the legal and social aspects of their situation remained unresolved. The question of their formal status came to a head when Mrs. Henderson, the woman from the local charitable society, paid another unannounced visit to assess the boys' welfare and living situation. Unlike her previous visit, this one carried an air of official scrutiny that made all three members of their household somewhat nervous. "Mr. Mitchell," Mrs. Henderson said as she settled into the parlor with her ever-present notebook, "I've received some inquiries from the territorial authorities about the 2 orphan children living on your ranch. There are questions about the legal arrangements and whether proper procedures have been followed." Daniel felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. After months of security and happiness, the threat of official intervention brought back all his fears about being separated from Timothy or forced into an institutional setting that would tear apart the family they had built. "What kind of procedures?" Jed asked calmly, though Daniel could detect tension beneath his composed exterior. "Formal guardianship arrangements, for one thing," Mrs. Henderson replied, consulting her notes. "The territorial government requires that orphan children either be placed with legally recognized relatives or formal guardians, or be sent to approved institutions for their care and education." Timothy moved closer to Daniel on the sofa, where they were sitting, his young face showing the fear that had become all too familiar during their months of uncertainty. Before finding refuge with Jed, "What would formal guardianship involve?" Daniel asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "It would involve Mr. Mitchell petitioning the territorial court to become your legal guardian," Mrs. Henderson explained. There would be paperwork, character references, and a formal hearing before a judge, if approved. You boys would become his legal wards until you reach the age of majority. Jed leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious but determined. And if we don't pursue formal guardianship, then the territorial authorities would be obligated to remove the boys from your care and place them in an approved institution, Mrs. Henderson said, though her tone suggested she found this possibility distasteful. The room fell silent as all three contemplated the implications of this ultimatum. For Daniel and Timothy, the prospect of being torn away from the only stable home they had known since their parents' death was terrifying. For Jed, the choice represented a formal commitment that would change his life permanently, but which he had already made in his heart months ago. How long do we have to make this decision? Jed asked. The territorial inspector will be visiting this area in 6 weeks, Mrs. Henderson replied. All irregularities in child placement must be resolved by then, or the children will be removed pending formal proceedings. That evening, after Mrs. Henderson had departed, the three of them sat around the dinner table discussing their options and what formal guardianship would mean for all of them. I want you to understand, Jed said seriously, that becoming your legal guardian is not something I would do reluctantly or out of obligation. You boys have become my family in every way that matters. Making it legal would simply recognize what already exists. But it would tie you down, Daniel pointed out, his protective instincts extending to the man who had saved them. You'd be responsible for us for years to come. And that's a big commitment for someone who was planning to live alone. Daniel, Jed said gently, I'm 68 years old. The years I have left are the ones I want to spend with people I care about. Watching you boys grow into the men you're meant to become, that's not a burden. It's a privilege. Timothy, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, finally spoke up with the directness that children often brought to complex adult situations. Do you want to be our real father? The question hung in the air, simple but profound in its implications. Jed looked at both boys, seeing not the desperate orphans who had arrived at his ranch months ago, but the confident, capable young men they were becoming under his guidance. More than anything in the world, Jed replied honestly, if you boys would like me to be your father. Yes, Timothy exclaimed immediately, launching himself into Jed's arms with the enthusiasm that had become his trademark. Daniel's response was more measured, but no less heartfelt. I can't think of anyone I'd rather have as a father, he said quietly. You've given us everything we lost and more. The formal guardianship proceedings took place 6 weeks later. In the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, Judge William Harrison, a stern but fair man who had handled hundreds of such cases, interviewed all three parties extensively before making his decision. Mr. Mitchell, the judge said after reviewing the character references and testimony, you understand that formal guardianship carries significant legal and financial responsibilities? I do, Your Honor, Jed replied. I also understand that it carries the privilege of helping these boys reach their full potential. And you boys, the judge continued, addressing Daniel and Timothy, you understand that accepting Mr. Mitchell as your legal guardian means you would be part of his family until you reach adulthood? Yes, sir, Daniel replied for both of them. That's what we want more than anything. Judge Harrison's stern expression softened slightly as he observed the obvious affection and respect that connected the three of them. In my experience, he said, the best families are often those that choose each other rather than those that are simply related by blood. I hereby grant formal guardianship of Daniel and Timothy Walsh to Jeremiah Mitchell, with all rights and responsibilities thereunder. The paperwork that followed was extensive but straightforward, legally changing the boys' names to Daniel and Timothy Mitchell, and establishing Jed's authority to make educational, medical, and other important decisions on their behalf. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Daniel felt a profound sense of completion that had been missing since his parents' death. He was no longer an orphan struggling to survive, but a son with a father who valued him and a future that held promise rather than uncertainty. What happens now? Timothy asked as they climbed into Jed's wagon for the journey home. Now we go home and get back to the work of being a family, Jed replied with satisfaction. We've got a ranch to run and futures to build. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a comfortable sense of resolution and new beginnings. They had faced the legal challenge and emerged stronger, with their bonds formalized, but their love for each other unchanged from what it had been. Since that first desperate night, when hunger and desperation had brought them together. Subscribe to help us continue sharing these stories that prove family is about choice, love, and commitment. 2 years had passed since Daniel and Timothy Walsh had become Daniel and Timothy Mitchell, and the transformation in both boys was remarkable to everyone who knew them. Daniel, now 16, had grown tall and strong, his shoulders broadening, with the physical demands of ranch work and his face showing the confident bearing of a young man who understood his place in the world. Timothy, at 10, had blossomed from the frightened, half-starved child who had collapsed on the road into a bright, curious boy whose love of learning was matched only by his enthusiasm for ranch life. His reading level now surpassed that of many adults, and his natural artistic talent had developed to the point where his sketches of ranch animals and landscapes showed genuine skill. The ranch itself had prospered under their combined efforts, expanding from Jed's original operation to include a successful horse breeding program that Daniel had proposed and helped implement. The Mitchell name was becoming known throughout the territory for producing reliable, well-trained horses that commanded premium prices. Daniel, Jed said one morning as they worked together to break a particularly spirited young stallion, "I've been thinking about your future, about what you want to do with your life." The conversation caught Daniel off guard, though he had been wondering when this topic would arise. At 16, he was old enough to begin making serious decisions about his career and his role in the family. "Business, I love working the ranch," Daniel replied honestly, continuing his patient work with the horse. "I can't imagine wanting to do anything else." "That's good to hear," Jed said with satisfaction. "But I want to make sure you're choosing this life because it's what you truly want, not just because it's what's available to you." The distinction was important, and Daniel appreciated Jed's concern for his autonomy and future happiness. Over the past 2 years, Jed had consistently treated him as a partner rather than simply a son to be directed, asking for his opinions on ranch decisions and involving him in long-term planning. "What are you suggesting?" Daniel asked. "I'm suggesting that we make your role here official," Jed replied. "I want to draw up papers making you a junior partner in the ranch, with a real stake in its success and a say in how it's run." The offer was both exciting and overwhelming. Daniel had dreamed of someday owning his own ranch, but he had assumed it would require years of saving money and finding his own land. The possibility of becoming an actual partner in the successful operation they had built together was beyond his most optimistic hopes. "What about Timothy?" Daniel asked, his protective instincts immediately extending to his younger brother. "Would he have the same opportunity when he's older?" "Of course," Jed assured him. "This ranch is big enough for all of us, and I hope someday it will pass to both of you boys. But Timothy has different interests and talents than you do. He might choose a different path." This was true. While Timothy enjoyed ranch life and was competent at the basic tasks required of him, his real passion lay in his books and his art. He had begun talking about possibly becoming a teacher or even attending college back east, dreams that Jed encouraged despite the cost and separation they would involve. "I want to accept your offer," Daniel said carefully, "but I want to make sure I earn it rather than just being given it because I'm your son." Jed smiled at the response, recognizing the integrity and work ethic that had made Daniel such a valuable partner even before any formal arrangement. "Son, you've been earning it every day for the past 2 years. This would just be recognizing what already exists." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, discussing Daniel's new status as junior partner, Timothy surprised everyone by bringing up his own plans for the future. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I grow up," Timothy announced with the seriousness that had become his trademark. When discussing important topics, "And what have you decided?" Jed asked, giving the boy his full attention. "I want to go to college and study to become a teacher," Timothy said. "But I also want to write books about the frontier, about families like ours and the people who are building new lives out here." The ambition was both admirable and challenging. College education was expensive and would require Timothy to leave the ranch for extended periods. But Jed had always emphasized the importance of education and following one's dreams. "That's a worthy goal," Jed said thoughtfully. "Have you given any thought to which college you might want to attend?" "I've been reading about schools back east," Timothy replied, pulling out a notebook where he had been researching his options. "There are some good teachers' colleges in Massachusetts and New York that also have strong writing programs." Daniel felt a pang at the thought of his brother leaving the ranch for several years, but he also felt proud of Timothy's ambition and determination to make something of himself beyond the security they had found with Jed. "We'll need to start planning for that," Jed said practically. "College requires preparation, both academically and financially. But if that's what you want, we'll find a way to make it happen." The conversation continued late into the evening, with all three of them discussing their dreams and plans for the future. For the first time since becoming a family, they were looking beyond simple survival and security to consider what they wanted to achieve and contribute to the world. Over the following weeks, Daniel threw himself into his new responsibilities as junior partner with characteristic determination. He began keeping detailed records of the ranch's operations, researching new techniques for animal husbandry, and developing plans for further expansion of their breeding program. His natural leadership abilities began to emerge as he took on more responsibility for managing the seasonal workers they hired during busy periods. The men, initially skeptical about taking direction from someone so young, quickly learned to respect Daniel's knowledge and fair treatment. "You've got a good head for this business," commented Bill Harrison, an experienced ranch hand who had worked for several operations throughout the territory. "Most boys your age think they know everything, but you listen to advice and think before you act." The compliment meant a great deal to Daniel, who was still sometimes insecure about his abilities despite the confidence that Jed consistently showed in him. External validation from experienced workers helped him believe that his success wasn't just due to Jed's generosity, but reflected real competence and potential. Timothy, meanwhile, had begun corresponding with representatives from several colleges, seeking information about their admission requirements and academic programs. His dedication to his studies intensified as he realized that his dreams would require exceptional preparation and achievement. "I need to be better than just good enough," Timothy explained to Daniel one evening as they worked together on their respective projects. "College costs money, and I want to earn scholarships that will reduce the burden on our family." The maturity and thoughtfulness that Timothy brought to planning his future impressed both Daniel and Jed. Despite his young age, he understood the financial implications of his ambitions and was determined to contribute to making them achievable. As spring turned to summer, the ranch bustled with activity as their breeding program reached its peak season. Daniel found himself coordinating the care of dozens of horses, managing breeding schedules, and supervising the training of young animals that would eventually be sold throughout the territory. The work was demanding but satisfying, requiring all the skills that Jed had taught him over the past 2 years plus new abilities that he was developing through experience and necessity. Each successful sale, each well-trained horse, each satisfied customer added to his growing confidence in his chosen career. "You're becoming quite the horseman," observed Mrs. Anderson during one of her visits to the ranch. "I remember when you first arrived here, so thin and scared. Look at you now, managing this operation like you were born to it." The observation reminded Daniel of how far he and Timothy had come since that desperate day, when hunger and exhaustion had brought them to Jed's door. They had not just survived their early hardships, but had thrived, growing into capable young men with bright futures ahead of them. That evening, as Daniel stood on the porch looking out over the ranch that was now partially his, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this place. The boy who had been willing to starve rather than abandon his little brother had become a man with the knowledge and resources to build something lasting. The arrival of autumn brought unexpected challenges when a neighboring rancher named Marcus Thornton began spreading rumors throughout the territory that Jed Mitchell was too old to properly manage his operation and that his adopted sons were nothing more than opportunistic drifters who had manipulated an elderly man for their own benefit. The accusations stung because they touched on insecurities that Daniel had never entirely overcome. Despite 2 years of success and acceptance, part of him still worried that others saw him as the desperate orphan who had lucked into a comfortable situation rather than a capable young man who had earned his place through hard work and dedication. "People are talking," reported Sam Miller, one of their seasonal workers, as he returned from a trip to town for supplies. "Thornton's been telling anyone who'll listen that you boys are taking advantage of Mr. Mitchell's generosity and that the ranch isn't being run properly." Daniel felt his jaw tighten with anger and frustration. Marcus Thornton owned a smaller, less successful ranch and had always resented the Mitchell operation's prosperity and growing reputation. The personal attacks seemed designed to damage both their business relationships and their standing in the community. "What exactly is he saying?" Jed asked calmly, though Daniel could see the tension in his posture. "He's claiming that Mr. Daniel here doesn't have the experience to be managing horses worth good money, and that you're not thinking clearly about business decisions," Sam replied reluctantly. "He's also suggesting that the boys might up and leave once they've gotten what they can from you." The last accusation was perhaps the most hurtful because it attacked the authenticity of the family bond that had become the foundation of all their lives. The suggestion that Daniel and Timothy were simply using Jed for material gain, rather than genuinely caring for him as a father, was deeply offensive to all three of them. "How are people responding to these rumors?" Daniel asked, dreading the answer but needing to know how much damage Thornton's campaign was causing. "Mixed reactions," Sam admitted. "Some folks know you boys well enough to see through the lies, but others who don't know your story might be influenced by what they're hearing." That evening, the family held a serious discussion about how to respond to Thornton's attacks. Daniel's first instinct was to confront the man directly and demand that he stop spreading lies, but Jed counseled a more measured approach. "The best way to counter false accusations," Jed advised, "is through our actions and our reputation. If we continue to run this ranch successfully and treat people fairly, the truth will become obvious to anyone with sense." "But what if his lies cost us business?" Daniel asked, voicing his fear that Thornton's campaign might damage the horse breeding operation they had worked so hard to build. "Then we'll deal with that challenge when it comes," Jed replied calmly. "But I've found that most people in this territory value results over gossip. Our horses speak for themselves." Despite Jed's reasonable counsel, Daniel found himself struggling with anger and frustration over the unfair attacks on their family and their work. The accusations touched on every insecurity he had ever felt about his worthiness and his right to the good life they had built together. Timothy, surprisingly, provided a different perspective on the situation during one of their evening conversations. "Danny, maybe Mr. Thornton is doing this because he's scared," the 10-year-old suggested with the insight that sometimes came from his voracious reading and thoughtful nature. "Scared of what?" Daniel asked. "Scared that what we've accomplished shows that his own failures are his fault, rather than just bad luck," Timothy replied. "If two orphan boys can help build a successful ranch, then maybe he doesn't have any excuses for why his own ranch isn't doing well." The observation was astute and helped Daniel see Thornton's behavior in a different light, rather than simply being malicious. The man might be lashing out from his own feelings of inadequacy and failure. The crisis came to a head 3 weeks later when a potential customer named Robert Hayes arrived at the ranch, having heard conflicting reports about the quality of their horses and the competence of their operation. Hayes was a wealthy rancher from Colorado who was looking to purchase breeding stock for his own operation, and his business could represent a significant financial opportunity. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Mitchell," Hayes said as Jed showed him around the ranch. "I've heard some concerning things about your operation. Questions about whether your young partner here has the experience to be handling valuable animals." Daniel felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger, but he forced himself to remain calm and professional. This was exactly the kind of damage that Thornton's rumors could cause, undermining their credibility with important customers. "I understand your concerns," Daniel replied evenly. "Why don't I show you some of our horses and let you judge for yourself whether they've been properly trained and cared for. What followed was the most important demonstration of Daniel's abilities that he had ever given. Under the scrutiny of an experienced horseman who was specifically looking for flaws and incompetence, Daniel put several of their finest animals through their paces, showing off the training and conditioning that had made the Mitchell ranches horses sought after throughout the territory. Hayes watched with growing interest and approval as Daniel worked with each horse, demonstrating not just the animal's abilities, but his own skill and knowledge. The horses responded to Daniel's commands with the precision and trust that only came from expert training and patient care. These are exceptional animals, Hayes admitted after watching the demonstration, and it's clear that whoever trained them knows what they're doing. Daniel trained most of them himself, Jed said proudly. He has a natural gift for working with horses, but more importantly, he has the patience and dedication to develop that gift properly. By the end of Hayes' visit, he had purchased 3 breeding mares and a young stallion, representing one of the largest sales the ranch had ever made. More importantly, he left as an advocate for the Mitchell operation, promising to recommend their horses to other ranchers in his area. I don't know what kind of lies people have been spreading about your operation, Hayes told them as he prepared to leave. But anyone with eyes can see that this is a first-class ranch run by people who know their business. The successful sale and Hayes' endorsement helped counteract much of the damage that Thornton's rumors had caused. But the experience had taught Daniel valuable lessons about the challenges of building and maintaining a reputation in a competitive business. You handled that situation perfectly, Jed told Daniel that evening. You let your work speak for itself instead of getting drawn into arguments and accusations. It was hard not to get angry, Daniel admitted, especially when he was questioning whether I'm competent to do work I've been doing successfully for 2 years. Anger is natural when people attack something you care about, Jed replied. But the measure of a man is how he handles that anger, whether he lets it control him or uses it to motivate him to prove his worth. Over the following months, Daniel found that the challenge from Thornton had actually strengthened his confidence and his commitment to excellence, rather than undermining his belief in himself. The attacks had forced him to examine his abilities honestly, and to recognize that his success was based on real competence rather than just luck or favoritism. The ranch continued to prosper, with their reputation for quality horses spreading throughout the territory and beyond. Daniel's role as junior partner became widely known and respected, and even former skeptics began to acknowledge his abilities and contributions. Timothy, meanwhile, had been accepted to preparatory programs at 2 Eastern colleges, with scholarship offers that would cover most of his expenses. His departure for school was still 2 years away, but the family had begun planning for the separation and the changes it would bring to their dynamic. I'm proud of both of you boys, Jed said one evening as they sat around the fire discussing their various successes and future plans. You've both grown into exactly the kind of men I hoped you would become. As Daniel looked around at the comfortable home they had built together and thought about the bright futures that lay ahead for all of them, he realized that Thornton's attacks had ultimately failed to damage anything important. Their family bond was stronger than ever, their business was thriving, and their place in the community was secure. The boy who had once been willing to starve rather than abandon his brother had become a man who could defend his family and his achievements against any challenge. The day that the Mitchell family had been preparing for over 2 years finally arrived when Timothy, now 12 years old and academically advanced beyond his years, was ready to leave for the prestigious preparatory academy in Massachusetts that would prepare him for college and his eventual career as a teacher and writer. The decision to send Timothy east for his education had not been made lightly. While Jed could have arranged for private tutoring or found adequate schooling closer to home, Timothy's exceptional abilities and clear career goals demanded the kind of specialized preparation that was only available at the finest educational institutions. I'm scared, Timothy admitted to Daniel the night before his departure as they sat together on the front porch of the ranch house, looking out over the land that had been their sanctuary for nearly 3 years. Scared of what? Daniel asked, gently, though he could guess at some of his brother's concerns. Scared that I'll get there and not be as smart as I think I am, Timothy replied honestly. Scared that the other boys will look down on me because I'm from a ranch instead of a city. Scared that I'll disappoint you and Jed after all the money you're spending on my education. Daniel felt his heart ache for his younger brother, remembering his own fears and insecurities when he had first begun taking on real responsibilities. At the ranch, the difference was that Timothy was facing his challenges hundreds of miles away from the family support that had helped Daniel overcome his doubts. Tim, Daniel said seriously, you're one of the smartest people I've ever met, and I've met plenty of educated folks through our horse business. You read books that challenge grown men. You think about ideas that most kids your age never even consider, and you express yourself better than most adults. But what if that's not enough? Then you'll work harder and learn more. The same way you've always done, Daniel replied with confidence. And you'll remember that you have a family here who believes in you completely and will support you no matter what challenges you face. The conversation continued late into the night, with Daniel sharing his own experiences of overcoming self-doubt, and Timothy expressing both his excitement about the opportunities ahead and his sadness about leaving the only stable home he had ever known. The morning of Timothy's departure dawned clear and cold, with the crisp autumn air that had become associated with both endings and beginnings in their family's story. Jed had arranged to accompany Timothy on the first leg of his journey, traveling by train to Denver, where the boy would transfer to the eastbound rail line that would take him to his new school. Remember, Jed said as he helped Timothy load his carefully packed belongings into the wagon for the trip to the train station, you're not just representing yourself at this school. You're representing our family and the values we've tried to instill in you. I won't forget, Timothy promised, his young voice steady despite the emotion he was clearly feeling. The farewell between the brothers was particularly difficult, as they had never been separated for more than a few days since their parents' death. Daniel felt as if part of himself was leaving with Timothy, the part that remembered their desperate journey together, and the bond that had been forged through shared hardship. Write to us every week, Daniel instructed, embracing his younger brother tightly. Tell us everything, even the small stuff. We want to feel like we're part of your adventure. I will, Timothy promised, and you have to write back and tell me everything that happens here. I want to know about every horse you train and every decision you make about the ranch. As the wagon carrying Timothy and Jed disappeared down the road toward town, Daniel stood alone in the ranch yard, feeling a profound sense of loss and change. For the first time since they had become a family, he would be managing the ranch entirely on his own, without either Timothy's help or Jed's constant guidance. The responsibility was both exciting and daunting. At 18, Daniel was young to be running such a substantial operation, but he had been preparing for this moment for years and felt confident in his abilities. The question was whether he could maintain the ranch's success while dealing with the loneliness of Timothy's absence. The first few weeks after Timothy's departure were challenging, as Daniel adjusted to the new routine and the quieter atmosphere of the ranch house. Meals felt strange with only 2 chairs occupied, and evenings lacked the lively discussions that Timothy's curiosity and enthusiasm had generated. Timothy's letters, which arrived weekly as promised, provided some comfort and connection to the brother whose absence left such a noticeable void in their daily lives. His reports from school were filled with excitement about his classes, descriptions of his fellow students, and detailed accounts of the academic challenges he was facing. The mathematics here is much more advanced than what I was studying at home, Timothy wrote in one letter, but I'm managing to keep up with help from my roommate, who's very patient with my questions. The English composition classes are my favorites, and my instructor says I have real potential as a writer. Daniel shared these letters with Jed upon his return from the East, and both men felt pride in Timothy's success and adaptability. The boy who had once been too weak from hunger to walk was now thriving in one of the country's most demanding academic environments. He's exactly where he belongs, Jed observed after reading Timothy's latest letter. It was hard to let him go, but he needed opportunities that we couldn't provide here. I miss him, Daniel admitted. The ranch doesn't feel quite the same without his questions and observations. "That's natural," Jed replied. "But you should also feel proud of what you've accomplished here on your own. The ranch has continued to prosper under your management, and you've proven that you're ready for full responsibility." Indeed, Daniel's management of the ranch during Jed's absence and the weeks since had been exemplary. He had successfully completed several horse sales, managed the seasonal workers with confidence and fairness, and made sound decisions about breeding and training programs that would benefit the operation for years to come. The recognition of his competence and independence felt good. But Daniel also realized that Timothy's departure marked the end of one chapter in their family's story and the beginning of another. The desperate orphans who had found refuge with a lonely rancher had grown into capable young men, ready to make their own contributions to the world. As autumn deepened into winter, Daniel found himself settling into new routines that reflected his evolved role in the family and the ranch. He began planning for the future with a confidence that would have been impossible just a few years earlier, considering expansions and improvements that would take advantage of their growing reputation and financial stability. Timothy's latest letter brought news that he had been selected for advanced placement in several subjects and was being considered for early admission to college programs that would allow him to begin his formal higher education ahead of schedule. "I sometimes can't believe how far we've all come," Daniel wrote in his reply to Timothy. 3 years ago, we were hungry and homeless. Now you're excelling at one of the best schools in the country, and I'm managing a successful ranch." Jed was right when he said that families choose each other. The thought brought him comfort as he faced the challenges and opportunities of his expanding role. The boy who had once protected his little brother through sheer determination had become a man capable of protecting and building the legacy that their chosen father had created for all of them. Subscribe to help us continue sharing these stories that prove love and family can overcome any obstacle. 5 years had passed since Timothy's departure for school, and the Wyoming Territory had witnessed remarkable changes in both the Mitchell Ranch and the young men who had helped build it into one of the most respected horse operations in the region. Daniel, now 23, had grown into a confident and capable rancher whose reputation for fairness and expertise extended far beyond the boundaries of their property. The ranch itself had expanded significantly under Daniel's management, now encompassing nearly 3,000 acres and employing a dozen full-time workers. The horse breeding program that Daniel had pioneered had become so successful that buyers traveled from as far away as California and Texas to purchase Mitchell-trained animals. Timothy, meanwhile, had not only completed his preparatory education with highest honors, but had graduated from Harvard College at the unprecedented age of 17. His letters home described his work as a teacher in a Boston school for underprivileged children, as well as his growing success as a writer whose articles about frontier life were being published in prestigious Eastern magazines. "Listen to this," Jed said one morning as he read aloud from Timothy's latest letter over breakfast. He says the Atlantic Monthly wants to publish a series of his stories about orphan children finding families on the frontier. He's calling it The Bonds We Choose. Daniel smiled with pride at his brother's accomplishments, though he sometimes missed the enthusiastic boy who had once peppered him with questions about ranch life and horse training. Timothy had grown into exactly the kind of educated, articulate man they had all hoped he would become. But success and distance had inevitably changed the dynamic of their relationship. Has he said anything more about coming home for a visit? Daniel asked, noting that it had been nearly 2 years since Timothy's last trip to the ranch. "He mentions it in every letter," Jed replied, "but his teaching duties and writing commitments seem to keep him constantly busy. I think he's also worried about how he'll fit back into ranch life after so many years in the city." The concern was understandable. Timothy had left Wyoming as a 12-year-old boy and was now returning as a 20-year-old man whose experiences and perspectives had been shaped by elite educational institutions and urban environments. The question of whether he would still feel at home on the ranch was one that worried all of them. The answer came unexpectedly when a telegram arrived announcing that Timothy would be arriving on the afternoon train, not for a brief visit but to stay for an extended period while he worked on a book about his family's story and the broader themes of frontier life and chosen families. Daniel felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he prepared to meet the brother he hadn't seen in 2 years. Would Timothy still be the same person beneath the polish of his Eastern education? Would they still have the easy companionship that had sustained them through their childhood struggles? The young man who stepped off the train at the depot bore little resemblance to the thin, frightened boy who had once collapsed from hunger on a dusty road. Timothy had grown tall and lean, with the bearing of an educated gentleman and the confident manner of someone accustomed to moving in sophisticated circles. But when his eyes met Daniel's across the platform, the smile that spread across his face was purely the Timothy that Daniel remembered. "Danny," Timothy called out, using the childhood nickname that no one else had ever been permitted to use. "Look at you. You've gotten even taller, and you look like you could wrestle a bear." The embrace between the brothers was fierce and emotional, 5 years of separation dissolving in an instant as they reconnected with the bond that had been forged in desperation and strengthened through love and shared experience. "Tim," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't believe you're really here. You look like a real city gentleman." "I am a real city gentleman," Timothy replied with a grin, "but I'm also still the same kid who used to help you gather eggs and learn to read by the fireplace in our home." The drive back to the ranch provided opportunities for both brothers to update each other on the details of their lives that didn't translate well into letters. Timothy was fascinated by Daniel's descriptions of the ranch's expansion and the challenges of managing such a large operation, while Daniel marveled at Timothy's stories of city life and his experiences in the publishing world. "I've missed this," Timothy said as they crested the hill that provided the first view of the ranch buildings. "I've lived in some beautiful places, but nothing has ever felt like home the way this does." Jed was waiting on the front porch when they arrived, and the reunion between the old rancher and his younger adopted son was deeply moving. At 73, Jed moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp, and his affection for both boys was as strong as ever. "My boy," Jed said, embracing Timothy warmly, "you've made us so proud. Every letter, every published article, every achievement has been a joy to celebrate." "I couldn't have done any of it without the foundation you gave me," Timothy replied. "Seriously, everything I've accomplished started right here, with the love and education and security you provided when I needed it most." That evening, as the family sat around the dinner table that had been the center of so many important conversations, Timothy explained his plans for the extended stay and the book he wanted to write about their experiences. "I want to tell the story of how 3 strangers became a family," Timothy said, his writer's enthusiasm evident in his voice. "But more than that, I want to explore the larger themes of what family means, how people create belonging in a world that can be harsh and unforgiving." "Will you be writing about the ranch?" Daniel asked, curious about how their ordinary daily life might translate into something worthy of publication. "The ranch is central to the story," Timothy replied. "It's not just the setting where we found each other, it's the symbol of what we built together. The success we've achieved here represents the possibility of creating something lasting and valuable through hard work and mutual commitment." Over the following weeks, Timothy threw himself into the research for his book with the same intensity that had marked his academic pursuits. He interviewed neighboring ranchers about their experiences with the Mitchell family, corresponded with people who had known them during their early years together, and spent hours documenting the details of ranch life that he wanted to capture accurately. Daniel found himself both subject and collaborator in Timothy's project, sharing memories and perspectives that he had never articulated before. The process of reflecting on their journey from desperate orphans to successful adults was both moving and enlightening, helping him understand the significance of what they had accomplished together. "You know what strikes me most about our story?" Timothy said one evening as they worked together on the book, Timothy writing while Daniel provided details and corrections. "It's not just that we survived or even that we succeeded. It's that we never lost sight of what was most important." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked. "I mean that we always put family first," even when we didn't have much else, when you were starving. You still made sure I got the last of the bread. When Jed took us in, he didn't just provide shelter. He gave us love and guidance. When I wanted to go to school, you and Jed supported my dreams even though it meant separation. Timothy paused in his writing to look directly at his brother. That's the real story here, Danny, not the rags to riches narrative. But the love conquers all reality. We proved that families can be created through choice and commitment, and that those chosen families can be every bit as strong as blood relations, as Timothy's stay extended through the summer and into the autumn. Both brothers began to consider what his permanent return to the ranch might look like. Timothy's writing was flourishing in the peaceful environment of their home, and he had begun to talk about the possibility of making the ranch his primary residence. While traveling periodically for research and publication commitments, I've realized something during these months here, Timothy told Daniel as they worked together on a particularly challenging horse training session. Success in the city is satisfying, but it's also empty in a way. I'm respected and well paid, but I'm not connected to anything larger than myself. Are you saying you want to come home permanently? Daniel asked, hardly daring to hope that their family might be reunited. I'm saying that home is where your family is, Timothy replied. And my family is here. My work can be done anywhere. But my heart belongs on this ranch with the people who made me who I am. The decision to have Timothy return permanently was celebrated by all three members of their family. But it also required practical planning about roles and responsibilities. Timothy's talents lay in different areas than Daniel's, but there were many ways that his education and writing abilities could benefit the ranch operation.